My son drained every dollar I had and flew off with his in-laws. But my payback. Ellie Price sat in her faded armchair, the one she had bought when her boy turned 7, staring at the glow of her phone in stunned silence. The banking app showed a balance she had never seen in her life. 0. She refreshed it once, twice, 3 times, as if numbers might change out of pity. They didn't. $80,000. Gone. Her entire savings, years of scrubbing other people's floors in fancy Los Angeles neighborhoods, years of skipping new shoes and vacations and decent furniture, had disappeared in a handful of digital transfers. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads. When she finally got through to a person at the bank, the answer slammed harder than the numbers themselves. The money had been wired to an account under the name Jackson Arthur Price. Her son. Her only child. The same child she had carried to work on her back when he was too small to walk. The same boy she had cheered through school, who she told everyone would be an accountant and never have to live with bleach on his hands like his mama. The representative on the line politely asked if she wanted to file a fraud complaint. Ellie hung up without replying. There were no words in her throat, just a weight pressing on her chest. The house around her felt older than ever. The ticking clock in the kitchen, the flicker of the tired light, the soft hum of the refrigerator, everything carried the sound of a long life lived on a tight budget. On the shelf, framed photos of Jackson charted the story of her sacrifices. Kindergarten, middle school, graduation. For each of those smiles, she knew exactly what she had given up. Her engagement ring, sold to pay tuition. Her father's land in Georgia, signed away so Jackson could attend college. Wedding costs she'd helped cover despite knowing his bride thought her beneath them. The landline rang, dragging her back to the present. Her neighbor Doris babbled excitedly that Jackson's Instagram was full of pictures from Rome. Wine glasses held high, white shirts pressed, smiles broad. His wife, Tonya, pressed against him, and beside them Tonya's mother, Rhonda, glowing like a woman who believed she had won the lottery. The caption read, "Rome, a new beginning. I deserve this." Under it, Tonya had written that good things come to those who wait, adding a special thanks to her mama-in-law, followed by a row of money emojis. Ellie didn't shout. She didn't throw the phone. Her eyes just followed the image on the screen, the expensive plates, the ancient stones in the background, her son's relaxed shoulders, and something in her finally clicked into place. She smiled, but not like before. It wasn't the tired smile of a woman who forgives everything. It was the quiet curve of someone who has stopped lying to herself. In Rome, Jackson told himself he'd done what he had to do. Tonya had insisted it was only using the money early, that his mother would never need that cash, not really. Tonya spoke about building a future, and Rhonda joked that the old woman probably didn't even know how to find an airport. They laughed over plates of food Jackson couldn't pronounce, pretending they were a family united in luxury. But under his well-fitted shirt, guilt moved like something alive, restless and uncomfortable. It stirred even more the night he overheard Tonya on the balcony, whispering about moving his mother's money into an account in Spain, getting rid of Jackson once it was done, and mocking the poor boy raised by a martyr. Back in south-central Los Angeles, Ellie reheated water on her old stove and watched the blue flame. Her hands shook slightly as she took out a notebook, the one she used to scribble recipes she never had time to make, and wrote one line, "This isn't the end. This is the beginning of my silence. And my silence will hurt more than any scream." Then she closed the cover and went to bed. For the first time in a long time, she slept without tears. Ellie's mornings had always started before sunrise. At 14, she'd been the girl who cleaned rich people's houses in Brentwood, scrubbing bathrooms while their kids slept late. At 17, she was pregnant and abandoned, carrying a baby boy and a bucket of cleaning supplies in the same arms. She learned early that no one was coming to rescue her. Work, not miracles, kept her fed. Jackson had been her whole world. She sang him to sleep when they didn't have a television. She made games out of plastic bottle caps when there were no toys. When a client offered to pay for his private elementary school if Ellie agreed to be a live-in maid, she moved without hesitation, spending the week on a rooftop room and crossing the city every weekend just to see him. She never arrived empty-handed. A notebook, a snack, a cheap toy, something to prove she'd been thinking of him every second she was gone. As Jackson grew, so did her sacrifices. She labored over her own shaky signature to sign school forms. She sold the family plot of land to cover his college enrollment. She endured snide looks from Tonya and Rhonda when they first visited her modest home, smiling while they disguised insults as compliments about her rustic walls and shelter-like kitchen. Every time one of them wrinkled their nose at her house, she swallowed the sting and focused on her son. But the distance between them widened. Jackson repeated Tonya's complaints about Ellie being too involved and stuck in old ways. He asked her not to come without calling, then asked her to stop calling as often. One afternoon, after a tense lunch, the doorman at his building told Ellie she couldn't come up unannounced. She walked all the way home instead of taking the bus, letting the city's heat burn into her skin while she counted every sacrifice she'd made. The first warning sign with her money appeared in the form of missing bank statements and unexplained changes. Jackson had persuaded her to let him organize her finances, telling her it would be safer in modern accounts. She didn't understand everything, but she understood trust. When her neighbor Brenda, a retired accountant, offered to help her check the transactions online, Ellie saw the truth. There were transfers she had never authorized and signatures she knew weren't hers. Day after day, she and Brenda wrote down each movement. Dates, hours, amounts. The numbers told a brutal story. Money had been siphoned slowly for months, and then, all at once. It was theft, not a mistake. Not a misunderstanding. Theft. And the thief wore the face of her child. Walter, the soft-spoken lawyer who'd once been her teenage crush, confirmed what she feared. He spread out her papers on his cluttered table and showed her a joint account she had supposedly agreed to, her name scrawled in clumsy imitation. He showed her how Jackson had tried to change records for her house, a failed attempt at tying the property to his investments. The willing ignorance she'd survived on evaporated. Around that time, another blow arrived. Her doctor called her in with a voice that didn't know how to soften bad news. The test results were clear. Advanced leukemia. 6 months, maybe less. There were treatments, but they were expensive, harsh, and uncertain. Ellie listened without shedding a tear. When the doctor asked if she understood, she answered that she knew exactly how much it cost to die with dignity. He offered chemotherapy. She refused. She wasn't interested in spending whatever time she had left hooked to machines in a hospital gown. On her way home, she walked familiar streets and let memories fall into place. The preschool she'd rushed Jackson to when she was late. The corner market where she'd cleaned restrooms for almost nothing. The neighbors who'd watched her grow older with each passing year. She entered her house, pulled out a wooden box, and carefully laid her life scraps on the table. Old notes, receipts, a picture of Jackson as a boy clinging to her leg. Her world had narrowed. Her time had shortened. But instead of collapsing, something inside her straightened. She bought a new red notebook and wrote on the first page, "To my son, I brought you into this world with pain and raised you with love. You stole from me with your eyes open. What I do next is not revenge. It is justice. And justice is the only thing I still own." Ellie no longer moved like a woman waiting to be hurt. She moved like someone who had accepted that hurt and decided what to do with it. Walter helped her draft a formal complaint: elder financial abuse, forged signature, fraudulent use of her identity. They attached copies of the altered documents, the bank statements, and a record of the transfers. They requested that the account Jackson used be frozen while the investigation proceeded. It wasn't simple. The system was slow, heavy with procedure and loopholes. But Walter, tired as he was of the law, still knew exactly which corners to lean on. While he filed forms and made calls, Ellie sat quietly with her hands folded in her lap, her mind already past fear. She didn't hope the money would magically reappear. She just wanted it to stop moving away from her. The bank responded. The complaint triggered internal protocols designed to protect older customers. As suspicion of abuse was registered, the authorities placed a block on the funds. The money Jackson had stolen was no longer available to him. At the same time, an alert was raised on his name. If he tried to shift more funds abroad, if he returned home with unexplained balances, he would have questions to answer. In her red notebook, Ellie carefully noted each step. Not for revenge, but for clarity. She wrote about how she had once believed silence was a form of love, about how she had let things slide in the name of peace. Now she understands that what you allow doesn't vanish. It grows teeth. She had permitted her son to put her aside, to treat her as an embarrassment, to use her name for convenience. The result was now in black and white in her accounts. Across the ocean, Rome glowed in filtered pictures. Jackson and Tonya filled their feeds with posed shots in front of ruins and fountains, adding captions about starting a new chapter. But beneath the photos, cracks widened. Tonya and Rhonda spent hours huddled together, whispering. They argued more with Jackson. Soon, the warmth in Tonya's eyes turned into boredom, then open contempt. The first sign that Ellie's actions had reached them came at a restaurant where Jackson tried to pay with his card. It was declined. He tried again. Declined. Another card. Declined. The waiter stood stiff and polite, but the eyes at surrounding tables turned toward them. Tonya's face twisted with fury. "What did you do?" she demanded later, on a narrow street slick with evening rain. "You messed it up. Your poor little mother must have made some problem. I told you she'd ruin this." Jackson stammered that he didn't understand. The bank app showed blocks and warnings he'd never seen before. He was summoned to the embassy the next day to discuss suspicious transactions tied to elder financial abuse. Tonya and Rhonda didn't care about the details. They cared that the money wasn't flowing anymore. Back in Los Angeles, Ellie drank tea in her kitchen while Brenda sat across from her. The older women spoke little, but their silence was no longer empty. It buzzed with knowledge, names, dates, and signatures. Ellie knew the law might not fix everything, might not heal her heart or repair her relationship with her son, but it would draw a line no one could uncross. One evening as the sun slid low, Ellie wrote another line in her red notebook. Sometimes love says, "I forgive you." Sometimes love says, "No more." I have reached no more. That night, Jackson opened his email and discovered messages he was never meant to read. A trail of digital conversations between Tonya and another man. They discussed his account, the trip, and their plan to abandon him once the transfers were completed. They laughed at his trauma from being raised by a cleaning lady. The words burned more than any insult his mother had ever received in front of him. For the first time in years, he thought of Ellie's hands, of the way she dragged herself to work when she was sick, of the days she'd gone without food so he could eat. Shame crept in where excuses used to live. He reached for his phone. His thumb hovered over his mother's number, but he didn't press it. Pride or cowardice, he wasn't sure which, kept him from dialing. He went to bed, but sleep did not come. Ellie slept. Not peacefully exactly, but with a settled resolve. Her body was weakening. The illness spread like a shadow in her blood. Still, each morning she woke up with a sense of purpose sharper than any pain. She saw clearly now. She couldn't save her son from the consequences of what he'd done. The most she could do was make sure those consequences finally reached him. The meeting at the embassy was nothing like Jackson's earlier fantasies of international travel. There was no glamour, no freedom. Just metal chairs, white walls, and the low murmur of official voices. He sat with his hands clasped while a staff member explained that the funds he'd transferred were under review according to U.S. laws protecting elderly account holders. To avoid arrest, he would need to cooperate fully, sign documents separating himself from access to his mother's accounts, and agree to follow up with authorities when he returned home. Tonya arrived in a red coat and dark sunglasses, looking irritated rather than worried. Rhonda appeared for a while, made a sarcastic comment about men who can't even steal correctly, and vanished again once it became clear the money was no longer theirs. The embassy's formality stripped their drama down to something simple. They had used an old woman's savings for a vacation and a fantasy escape plan, and now that fantasy was collapsing. Then the door opened and Ellie stepped inside. She wore a plain sweater, long skirt, and a dark scarf over the bandana hiding her thinning hair. Her steps were careful, but her back was straight. She clutched a yellow envelope to her chest as she walked through the room. When Jackson looked up and saw her, he felt his breath snag. "What are you doing here?" he blurted. His voice sounded like it belonged to someone younger, someone smaller. "I came to watch," Ellie answered. Her tone was calm, almost gentle. "Not as your mother today. As the person whose name you used." Tonya rolled her eyes and made a cruel joke about the old lady's final performance. Ellie's gaze slid over her without heat. There was no fight left in her for people who had never seen her as human. Her anger was reserved for the one person who still had a claim on her heart. She stepped close enough to hand Jackson the envelope. Inside, he found photos of himself as a child, learning to walk, holding his first school certificate, holding on to her skirt. There was also a short letter written in looping blue ink, telling him she had once believed he would grow up to be the proudest thing she'd ever done. "I kept everything," she told him quietly. "Even when you stopped keeping me." The embassy official entered with a folder of documents. The room shifted into bureaucratic mode again. Papers were placed in front of Jackson. Paragraphs were read aloud reminding him of the legal consequences of forgery and misuse of funds. His hand shook as he signed away access to accounts he should never have touched. The pen scratched loudly on the paper, a thin sound in the heavy stillness. In a corner, a tourist waiting for his own appointment discreetly recorded the scene on his phone. The weary woman with the envelope, the man in the rumpled shirt trying not to cry, the quiet words that passed between them. Later, that clip would travel across social media, praised as a moment of a mother teaching a brutal lesson. But in the small embassy room, it was simply a painful, private truth. When the official declared the process complete, Tonya sighed dramatically and headed for the door. She didn't look back at Jackson. She had no use for him without money. Rhonda had already disappeared into the stream of people outside. In minutes, the man who had flown across the world feeling powerful found himself almost entirely alone. Ellie walked out with him. They stepped into a narrow street where the sound of traffic and voices bounced off stone walls. For a moment they just stood there, mother and son facing each other in a foreign country that meant nothing to her except this moment. "This is where we part," Ellie said finally. "Can't you come home with me?" Jackson asked, his words rushing together. "Can't we fix this? I know I messed up, but I already forgave you," she said, cutting him off. "That's not the issue anymore. Forgiveness and consequences are not the same thing. You will live with what you did. That's your work now, not mine." He reached for her arm and stopped himself. For the first time, he understood that he no longer had the right to ask anything of her. She had given him life, food, schooling, and the last of her strength. He had given her a broken heart and a few viral minutes on a stranger's phone. Ellie turned and walked away, her steps slow but unwavering. Her body was fragile, but her decision wasn't. She didn't look back. Jackson stood watching her until the crowd swallowed her up. When she vanished from view, an ache he hadn't felt since childhood returned, a sense that he'd lost something no amount of money or apologies could replace. That night, in a cheap room that smelled of old smoke and despair, he opened the letter she had handed him. She had written that she loved him once beyond sense, that she had gone hungry so he wouldn't, that she had believed in him long after he stopped believing in her. She also wrote that love without limits had turned into a chain around her neck, and that by cutting it, she was saving herself at the end and maybe, someday, saving him. He cried quietly, shoulders shaking. Not because he'd been humiliated or exposed, but because the one person who had never given up on him had finally stepped back. Ellie returned to Los Angeles knowing exactly how little time she had left. The illness moved faster now, tiring her easily, thinning her body, softening her muscles. But her spirit felt lighter. The money was no longer disappearing. Her house, though cracked and humble, remained legally hers. The people around her, Walter, Brenda, the neighbors who had watched her sweep the sidewalk for decades, helped her with errands, medicines, and cooking. Word of what she had done traveled quietly through the neighborhood long before the video of the embassy scene exploded online. Some said she'd flown overseas to stop criminals. Others whispered that she'd stood up to her own son in a way few mothers could. Children watched her pass and wondered how such a small woman could carry something so large inside her. She settled back into her routine as best she could. Afternoon blues songs played low on the radio. The rocking chair creaked under her slight weight as she watched kids run by with scuffed shoes and loud laughter. From time to time, one of them would hand her a flower or a drawing, and she'd thank them as if they'd given her gold. Her house was filled not with expensive objects, but with small offerings: a soup from Brenda, a bag of groceries from a neighbor, a repaired light bulb from a teenager she'd once helped with homework. Jackson, meanwhile, returned to the United States like a man walking into his own sentencing. His name circulated online, attached to clips and angry comments about ungrateful children. Former co-workers avoided him. Old friends pretended they were too busy to answer. Tonya and her mother had cut all ties, disappearing into a new scheme or just another life where he didn't exist. He wandered the streets of his old neighborhood, past the school where his mother had walked him in worn-out shoes, past the market where she'd cleaned restrooms. Every corner pulled up an image he had tried to forget. Her calloused hands. Her tired smile. The way she had always told him he was meant for more than a mop and bucket. He had reached that more, for a while, and then thrown it away for people who never loved him. One day, he found himself standing across the street from his mother's house. The paint was older, the gate more rusted, but it was still the same place he'd once raced into with scraped knees and childish tears. On the porch, Ellie sat in her rocking chair, thinner than he remembered, wrapped in a shawl. She laughed softly as neighborhood children chattered at her feet. One little boy handed her a small wildflower. She lifted him onto her lap, hugging him with the same tenderness she had once reserved for Jackson alone. He didn't cross the street. He couldn't. Shame rooted his feet to the sidewalk. After a few minutes, he set down a bag of donuts on her steps, as quietly as a thief returning what he had stolen, and walked away. He did the same the next week and the next, leaving small offerings: bread, flowers, handwritten notes with no name. He never rang the bell. He never looked through the window. It was not reconciliation. It was the beginning of a long, hard attempt at becoming someone different. Ellie knew he was coming. She recognized the pattern of footsteps retreating down the street, the familiar shape of his shoulders in her peripheral vision. But she didn't rush to the door. She didn't call his name. Instead, one evening she opened her red notebook and wrote her last words to him. That love cannot be demanded, only given, that real forgiveness begins when a person stops hurting others and starts repairing what they can. She wrote that if he ever truly changed, he would see her face in the eyes of other women who needed respect, and that how he treated them would be her true legacy. The morning she died was bright and clear. Sunlight pooled on the floor, warming the rug beneath her chair. She sat with the red notebook on her lap and a sealed envelope labeled, "For Jackson," beside it. When the neighbors found her, her expression was calm. There were no signs of struggle or fear, only the peace of someone who had finished what she needed to do. The wake was simple, as she would have wanted. No lavish decorations, just flowers picked from nearby yards, children's drawings, and soft music. Walter and Brenda organized everything. The neighbors came not out of obligation, but out of gratitude. They told stories of how she'd watched their kids, lent them money she could barely spare, or just listened to them on long, tired evenings when life felt heavy. Jackson arrived without being called. He knew the moment she was gone without needing a phone call. Something inside him had gone quiet, like a light turned out. He walked into the living room and saw her body surrounded by candles. No one stopped him. No one embraced him. He approached and took her cold hands in his. They were smaller than he remembered, but still the same hands that had carried him when he was nothing. Next to her lay the envelope with his name. He opened it and read her final note, line by line. She didn't repeat his faults. She didn't list every betrayal. Instead, she told him she still believed he could be better than the man he had become. That belief pierced deeper than any accusation. He cried quietly, the way she had always endured pain, in silence. Later, he found an old wooden box in her room. It held the same photo she'd once given him in Rome, now with a message written on the back in her careful handwriting. "I still believe in you, son." He pressed the picture to his chest and stepped outside to sit in the chair where she used to watch the world. Rumor spread that the man who once disappeared to Europe now lived alone in Ellie's house. There were no luxury cars, no expensive furniture, just the old armchair, the red notebook, and a single photo on the shelf. He took small jobs, helped neighbors, silently refused shortcuts and easy money. He never tried to explain himself to anyone. He knew explanations wouldn't erase what he had done. Some said he was punishing himself. Others said he was guarding what remained of his mother's world. But if someone looked closely, they would see something else. A man trying to rebuild from the only solid foundation he had left. Her example. Ellie's justice hadn't come with shouting, violence, or revenge. It had arrived quietly, signed on embassy papers, sealed in notebooks, carried in the decisions she made in the last months of her life. She stopped her son's theft. She protected what she had built. She died with her head high. And she left behind a simple truth that outlived both money and scandal. When love finally chooses self-respect, it doesn't stop loving. It simply stops allowing itself to be destroyed.